Hello, I am Jake Saunders and welcome to Retro TV, the show dedicated to everything retro. Over the past few years, we've seen many retro trends come back into the spotlight. Vinyls, clothes, and arcades are just a few that have come back in just recent memory. But one trend that has certainly exploded in popularity, due in part to the pandemic, has been analog photography, with many choosing film over digital. That's right. On today's episode of Retro TV, we are taking a deep dive into the world of analog photography.
It was long said that the onset of digital would bring about an end to analog photography, but it seems that film has lasted way past the expiration date. The distinct grain and colours of film gave all photographers something to love. The past few years alone saw skyrocketing demand, with film manufacturers and processors having to keep up with an ever-growing interest. Prior to 2020, however, it was a different story. The history of analog photography dates back to 1827, when Joseph Niepce used a camera obscura to capture an image for the first time. Film as we know it today came about in 1885, with George Eastman creating the first roll of flexible film. Several innovations followed, 35mm movie film being made in 1889, the first roll of colour film in 1907, and so on and so forth. In 1913, the first 35mm film cameras were produced, but weren't the standard until Leica popularised it in 1925. By this point, analog photography primarily belonged to hardcore enthusiasts and those who could afford it. However, in the late 60s, demand for 35mm cameras began to skyrocket, with the average person being able to afford such cameras. The innovations didn't stop there. Popular formats like 120 and instant film also gained momentum. But as the 20th century drew to a close, demand for film cameras slowly dwindled. As digital became the new king, film was primarily relegated to the second-hand market and die-hard enthusiasts. The last film camera, the Canon EOS 1V, was released in the year 2000, supposedly ushering out an era. In 2014, film processing labs began to notice a steady uptake in film being brought to them for development. Potentially correlated was the wide release of the Instax Mini 8. Although the camera was seen as more of a party gimmick and a fun fad deemed not to last, said camera outsold flagship digital cameras of that same year. 9 years on, film is clearly a resurfaced trend. And with the rallying war cry of "film never dies," it isn't too hard to imagine that it won't stick around.
For those looking to find more information about the history of analog photography, head to the link on your screen. In this hand, I have the Instax Mini 8, a camera that's potentially brought new lights to analog photography. Now, we say potentially as there isn't really any concrete evidence that the camera is ushering a new era, but we have asked employees at the film processing labs and they seem to say that it lines up with the timeline. And it's not hard to see why. Such a camera is easy to operate. You press the button here, which extends the lens, and we adjust the camera to the appropriate light settings, and we point and click. And while the film prints, I'll leave this here. 10 minutes later, you've got yourself a shot. It's also important to mention that the 35mm camera has also played a role as a reigning champion in the many formats of film cameras, and it's not hard to see why. The abundance of both colour and black and white film available to the general public, along with its similarity to its digital brethren, gave it a versatility that no other format really has. It's most likely the first camera that people interested in photography will really use, but how does it work? To answer this question, we are joined by a returning friend of the show, Grace Stevenson.
My name is Grace Stevenson and I am 23 years old. My first true experience with film photography was in late 2021 when I enrolled in an analog photography class at Deakin. My first film camera that I shot on was a hand-me-down from my father. However, my very first film camera that is unfortunately broken was given to me by my grandmother after my grandfather passed away. I tend to fall more towards film photography simply for the product and not knowing what the final product may look like. I can take 2 different rolls of film from 2 different companies and take photos on both of them at the exact same time of day, in the exact same location, with the exact same camera and settings, but they're both going to look completely different. I have thought about switching to digital photography, mostly when earlier in 2022 there was a little bit of a film shortage, but now that that's been remedied and it's easier to get my hands on actual rolls of film, I haven't felt the need to really push myself towards digital photography. I think I enjoy the aspect of holding all of the instruments and tools of the trade in my hands. I can put the roll of film in, I can pull it back, I can shoot with it, and then I can hand it off to somebody who's going to give me the physical roll back when this is all said and done. My camera works like most film cameras, circa probably the 70s. There's a little back piece and you pull this trigger up and it opens up the back of the camera. You put the film in, you push the frames over to the side and you insert the end of the film roll into the other side of the camera. Then you just pull the trigger a couple of times, close the camera back up, and you're pretty much ready to start shooting. I think my one big piece of advice is just to keep trying. Get your hands on a cheap camera and some cheap rolls of film and work your way up to a more expensive camera or more expensive film, because no matter what you do, I think you'll always be happy with the end product.
Thanks so much, Grace, for your insight and sharing your wonderful photos with us. I'm sure they inspired a great deal of our audience. If you want to get a close look at the images, check out the link on screen. The world of analog photography is a marvelous playground, covering a wide range of formats and cameras, from large prints to the humble point and shoot. And what's unique about different film cameras is that they all take different kinds of film. Throughout the episode, you might have heard us mention 30mm and 120mm film and instant film. But speaking of instant film, it's ready to go. This here is our photo. But how does film work? How do you turn this into wonderful photos?
It all begins with the film roll itself. Aside from the various sizes, films also come in different varieties. You have colour positive, colour negative, and black and white film. These all come with their own processing requirements, signified here. A colour negative roll, for instance, undergoes what is known as the C41 process. This information is important to those who hand process their films, but also is important for the friendly neighbourhood photo lab. Photobarn has been processing film since 1963. It specialises in processing colour and black and white film. The process between the two is relatively similar, with chemicals preserving the exposures captured by the photographers, producing what is called a negative. The main difference here is the approach. Colour film is machine processed, while the film goes through a chemical bathing process to preserve the exposures. The advantage is shorter waiting time for the development process, with Photobarn able to finish a roll in about an hour's time. Black and white film, however, has to be hand processed due to a different chemical process. This process can take anywhere from 2 days to a week. The negatives are then scanned and inverted, creating the final product, a digital image with all the perks of film. The grain and the colours preserved for you to enjoy. Truly a magnificent invention that could only be rivaled by the moon landing.
You can find Photobarn at Burwood One Shopping Centre at 172 Burwood Highway, Burwood East. Thank you so much for your time, by the way. We really appreciated the insight that you gave us just before. But when it comes to retro, there are so many things that have remained popular after decades of being out of style or outdated, but we can't cover everything in 6 episodes. Hence why we've created a fun little segment called Retrofit. And this week we will talk with an amateur movie critic and a good friend of ours, Josh Malcolm, about the retro trends that influence modern cinema.
Today we're going to be joined by a friend of the show, Josh Malcolm, an amateur film critic, and is here to discuss the influence of retro trends on film and TV. I'll just get him on the line. G'day, Josh. How are you, mate?
Doing well, thanks, mate. It's good to be here.
Josh, we've been seeing a lot of so-called legacy sequels like Top Gun Maverick, Matrix Resurrections, and Ghostbusters Afterlife. Could you tell us what makes a film a legacy sequel and what makes them so popular?
Yeah, so a legacy sequel basically is when a franchise hasn't had an installment in a little while, and then either the original creators or the studios want to make a new film in the franchise. And you bring back the original actors after a number of years, very often playing against a younger cast as well. And it often looks at the legacy of the original film and the original characters in the context of the 21st century and what modern culture looks like as well.
Now, these legacy sequels often rely quite heavily on nostalgia to sell their audiences. Do you think this is a problem, and how can a film use nostalgia appropriately?
So nostalgia, it can be an issue if used poorly, although when used well or sparingly, it can be really effective as well in movies. The biggest issue with nostalgia is if it's just cheap, and films like Ghostbusters Afterlife got absolutely destroyed for this because it just had a bunch of old references to the original movies, but it didn't have anything of true substance for itself to say. Whereas other films like, Top Gun Maverick and the Cobra Kai TV series, all of those are legacy sequels which have nostalgia and can sometimes even have similar story beats, but put through a new lens and are almost analysing the effects of the original film and the original characters in the 21st century.
Now, Josh, recently we saw Stranger Things Season 4 bring back a classic 80s song, Running Up That Hill by Kate Bush. How else does film and TV reignite retro trends?
So music is a big one when it comes to film and TV reigniting retro trends. We have even films that are set in the modern day can very often use older music. Stuff like the original Iron Man and Guardians of the Galaxy movies. They all very well known for using older music. Other aspects which film can bring back as well, stuff like clothing trends. I know that Stranger Things 4 is set during the 80s, so we have a bunch of 80s clothing trends in that, and some of those have been brought back into the present day as well, possibly ill-advisedly.
People tend to consume most of their media content via streaming services like Netflix and Disney+. Do you think that going to the cinema will eventually become a retro trend all of its own?
No, I don't think that, and I also certainly do not hope that as well. The cinema is such an incredible experience, and we saw last year, two of the biggest films of last year were Top Gun Maverick and Avatar: The Way of Water, with both of them being box office sensations and Avatar becoming the third or fourth highest grossing movie of all time. I think people are realizing across the pandemic that the cinema is a true experience, not just about the movies, it's about getting together with friends. And also, corporations are learning it as well. We saw throughout the pandemic, even though subscription numbers skyrocketed for services like Disney+, Netflix, HBO Max even, all of those companies still posted massive losses, even though they were putting all their original content onto those streaming services.
Thank you so much for coming to talk to us on the show, mate.
Thank you very much for having me.
Now, if you want more film and TV goodness, you can follow Josh at HONJoshM on Instagram. But until next time, this has been Retrofit, and I've been Aiden. Thank you so much for watching.
And unfortunately, that's all the time we have for today. But keep up to date with us. You can check out our Instagram at retro.television.31 or sign up to our newsletter on the website on the screen. Next week, we'll be taking a deep dive into the kitchen for retro food. But for now, I've been Jake Saunders, and this is Retro TV.